Shantel is a historian of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, with a particular focus on the British Caribbean. She's currently a lecturer in transatlantic slavery at the University of Glasgow. Thank you for being with us here today, Shantel.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Amanda and Cecil in particular. I'm excited to share the influence that Walter Rodney has had on my scholarship and my teaching, and also reflect on the experience of being a student at SOAS and being exposed to his ideas. So I hope you all can see my screen. Let me know if you can't. In March 2021, Adam Habib, SOAS's newly appointed director, was suspended following the use of the N-word in an online forum. In an attempt to defend himself, Habib, a South African of Asian heritage, stated context matters. Responding to Habib, a student evoked the work of Walter Rodney, the SOAS alumni, who gained his PhD at the mere age of 24. The student stated, our own alumni, Walter Rodney, has written why people, non-Black POC and white bodies shouldn't use the N-word. A petition calling for Habib's dismissal stated that the incident was emblematic of the experiences that Black students go through at SOAS and the institution's historical failure to deal with them. For us as a Black student body, the petition continued, we shall not accept leadership from a director who is racist and does not understand the African condition, African history, and why there are Black Africans in the diaspora. Even under the leadership of the previous director, the Guyanese-born Baroness Valerie Amos, student felt shortchanged. Amos's neoliberal agenda was evidenced by his support of the Iraq War as a Labour politician, but also circumstances within SOAS. There's a lot to be said here, but I think what's really impactful or iconic to me is the disillusion of several courses, including the foundational BA in African Studies under her watch, which has been replaced by a sort of generic program called the BA in Languages and Cultures. And one must remember that SOAS problematically stands for the School of Oriental and African Studies. And by slashing this key course, you might wonder where the African in SOAS is. So returning to Habib, an external investigation was conducted, and it was found out that whilst he was wrong to use the N-word, it did not make him a racist. So Habib resumed his role in May 2021, and several recommendations were put forward to address the pain and distress it caused, including a clear policy or formulating a clear policy on the use of the N-word in the SOAS community. I want to suggest that this incident reveals something about the climate at SOAS, its anti-Blackness, but also illustrates the important contribution of one of SOAS's former Black students. By evoking Rodney, this case speaks to the enduring intellectual and political inspiration on students from multiple disciplines, history, politics, development, especially students from African heritage, who often draw from the life and work of Rodney, who completed his PhD at SOAS 55 years later. And also to mention, there's a Walter Rodney Prize fund, which recognizes student excellence for the work on the history of Africa and the African diaspora. And this was not set up by SOAS, it was set up by his widow in memory of him in 2019, Patricia Rodney. And there's also a poster at SOAS, one of their influential alumni that sort of litters the staircase as you go up. And it's a recent addition. I do not remember seeing it, well, it was not in existence when I was a student 14 years ago, and when I was a PhD student 6 or 7 years ago. So I'll add a caveat here. that I was undergraduate at SOAS from 2004 to 2007. So my work kind of speaks, the presentation speaks to these years, my experiences, and also 2011, 2017, where I did my PhD and taught a course on transatlantic slavery. So my personal experience in this case is drawn from these years. So I will draw on this experience, excerpts from Walter Rodney Speaks, and also the historiography on Western Africa and the Atlantic slave trade to consider the ways in which Rodney's historical work and legacy is remembered in the institution. So on arrival at SOAS, in his own words, Walter Rodney talks about his experiences in Walter Rodney Speaks. He had an open scholarship to attend SOAS following his first class degree in history at UWI Mona. His academic qualifications were belittled. He writes, "The question was raised as to whether or not I had to take some qualifying exams or to do some papers in their undergraduate work, since he had come from the colonies." And he recognized that SOAS was this institution set up to train colonial administrators in administering the British Empire. He describes the African history section, or maybe African section as it was in SOAS back in the day, as involved in the defense of bourgeoisie ideology. And he found his supervisor, Richard Gray, he calls him a liberal bourgeoisie historian, but sympathetic and helpful. Now, no surprise, Rodney was highly critical of this academic community, but from Walter Rodney Speaks, he makes it clear that he felt that he didn't want to leave the scholarship in the hands of the enemy. His quote there, "in the hands of the enemy," and that some material was loaded and ideologically very hostile, but it was an important mental exercise in mastering the tools of the discipline of history. So Rodney maintained contact with his supervisor, Gray, and especially when Rodney was in Tanzania, Rodney contributed essays to the Cambridge History of Africa, 1600 to 1790, edited by Gray. Gray also wrote Rodney's obituary in 1918 in the London Times, describing him as one of the most significant third world historians of his generation. So, as Kevin said, how Europe Undeveloped Africa aimed to circumvent some of the academic conventions, especially he did not use footnotes, which is a convention within history. And this was for accessibility, aimed to operate outside the institution to reach his own people. And the history of the Upper Guinea Coast was based on his PhD, and it aimed to put slavery in the context of capitalism and examine the impact of external forces especially from namely the Portuguese across the Atlantic, but also the ruling elites of the interior. So I will draw on these two works, as well as a couple of other articles that Rodney wrote, to talk about his key ideas, but also how it was critiqued and supported by historians thereafter. So how was Walter Rodney's work remembered and treated within history classes? So I'll go over this by looking at the historiography. So Walter Rodney argued that African societies were developing independently until overtaken by Europeans, and Europeans underdeveloped Africa, creating this relationship of dependency. The Atlantic slave trade was an unequal partnership between ruling elites and Europeans and the masses of people suffering. He also commented on, he would say, so-called slavery, defining these systems of dependency within Africa as being very different to chattel slavery. And I could say more about that, but I'm going to condense some of the material because I know time is limited. In terms of the economic impact of the transatlantic slavery, he talked about the goods, the cheap, rubbish goods that strangled African industries. The importance of warfare on economics, agriculture, the gun slave cycle, which is put forward by other historians such as Inokori, which talks about the importance of the importation of guns and the social violence, political legacies of this. He also mentioned large states such as Dahomey and Ashanti, which grew powerful because of European guns, and also the attempts by some African leaders to curb the slave trade. He mentions the demographic loss, the loss of inventiveness, the development opportunity. And so the context of Walter Rodney's work is definitely located in this dependency theory and is anti-capitalist. So we're introduced to Rodney's foundational ideas within the history classes, but often his work was dismissed in favor of other historians. I'll introduce one such as, quite a few actually, the Atlanticist, Americanist, David Altis, in his book, his 1987 book. He argued that the transatlantic slave trade didn't affect African societies much, and it had a weak influence on African economies. Controversially, he argued that the imported American foodstuffs, such as maize and cassava, revolutionized agriculture in Western Africa and actually helped population growth. So he argues that any demographic impact was offset by population growth due to the high calorific intake of these American crops. We can see immediately the hostile environment, intellectually hostile environment that is produced at SOAS. In another essay, 1988, Altis teamed up with the historian, I believe, Jennings, to say this, not only to minimize the impact of the slave trade, but that the majority of Africans would have been about as well off and would have been performing the same tasks in the same socio-economic environment had there been no slave trade. J.D. Fage, another historian who taught at SOAS, explicitly challenged Rodney's ideas in 1975. He argued for the existence of forms of dependency, unfreedom, slavery before the Atlantic slave trade, and that Europeans simply tapped into this existing form of slavery, in order to supply captives for the Americas. Fage states that Rodney represented the Black peoples of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, whereas I, Fage, stem from the race and culture that did the exploitation. He described Rodney as a romantic. And as a student reading Fage, it was surprising that he articulated his own positionality. And this was often missing from interpretations of the past. So myself and some of my peers felt, well, we were cognizant of the historians that we read, who were overwhelmingly white and male, and came to the study of history with their own biases, and it's particularly clear from Altis's work. And Fage's work. So Fage minimizes the impact of the slave trade and offensively summarizing, even, he says, in the worst areas, the effect of the slave exports may have been no more than to cream off surplus population. And obviously this is a very hostile claim. There have been several historians since Walter Rodney, such as Inakuri, who famously wrote the prominent book, Africans, the Industrial Revolution in England. And he talks about the importance of the gun slave cycle, as it's called, the thirst for weapons, the thirst for enslaved peoples, and the number of guns that were imported to Africa, especially in the 18th century. And that slavery, and that the issue of slavery and domestic slavery, he stresses that the issue is not whether it existed before the Atlantic slave trade, but what the Atlantic slave trade did to the extent and character of slavery in the region. So the debate over the impact of the Atlantic slave trade has continued into the 90s and 2000s. And you have a book by John Thornton called Africans and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World. As you can tell from the title suggests that African elites played a critical role in the development of the slave trade. It argues several things, just to point out a few, that there were short-term benefits for African elites, such as political expansion, whereas Rodney emphasizes, maybe similar in some sense, that African rulers in West Africa and this is from his 1967 article, and if you want the name, I have it, were in full political control during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. But crucially, Rodney argues that this was detrimental to the African peoples, and this is something that Thornton doesn't generally stress. And on the issue of slavery, Rodney's argument is that forms of dependency within Africa was expanded as a result of the slave trade, whereas Thornton argues that forms of dependency were already widespread in Africa, and that the slave trade was just an outgrowth of internal slavery. Controversially, he says, internal slavery was thus as much as responsible as any external force for the development of the Atlantic slave trade, placing the responsibility on African societies. And Rodney warns that describing Africa's role in the slave trade as major is an attempt to excuse Europeans by placing blame and responsibility on Africans, and discusses the global power that Europeans had, and acknowledging at the same time that African leaders collaborated with Europeans, drawing parallels with present-day African leaders in the neo-colonial environment. Another historian is Patrick Manning, and briefly, he focuses on the human loss that Walter Rodney focused on, and noted that in 1850, around the end of the Atlantic slave trade in Africa, Africa's population was half of what it would have been in the absence of the slave trade. So he stresses the acute demographic impact on African societies as a result of warfare, political instability, etc. And one historian that was very influential to me and how I thought about African history and the slave trade was Biba Carter. His 1998 book looks at Senegambia and the unity, so that would include Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea. And he looks at the impact of the Atlantic slave trade, the importation of guns, the clash between traditional African rulers and Muslim authorities, the consolidation as well as breakup of states, and the economic stagnation, the chronic violence, the loss in productive labor in his regional case study. He acknowledges Rodney as a late friend and his groundbreaking work in the region. He looks at this history and how it contributed to the current underdevelopment and dependence of Senegambia. So another historian is David Warthrop in 2002, who talked about the limited economic development in Africa that occurred during the transatlantic slave trade. So limited economic development. And he says, in some cases, imported cloth damaged indigenous textile industry, and in other areas, there was an expanded market able to absorb both local imported cloth. But the issue of technology is stressed by Northrop, and he says, there was little or no technological transfer between Europe and Africa. Indeed, it wouldn't have been in Europe's best interest for there to be, example, gun manufacturing industries in Western Africa. Linda Hayward, who's famously written a book on Nzinga recently, in her work, she stresses the importance of Congo's ties to Western Europe and how until the 18th century, Congo was protected those who were born in the kingdom from slavery, even going as far as sending peoples or representatives to Brazil and bringing back those who were falsely enslaved. So it's a really interesting case study looking at how the Kingdom of Congo, although it was involved in the transatlantic slave trade with Europeans, also attempted to curb that slave trade and put an end to it too. Another historian is Okoji, who talks about the widespread forms of dependency within Africa described by Lado Equiano. And I think what's so interesting about Nkoji's work is the focus or acknowledging that slavery is a global and ancient institution, and its existence in Africa cannot satisfactorily explain why the continent supplied captives to Europeans. And he agrees with Rodney about how the local and religious power in Igbo land were manipulated by the ruling elite for profit. Finally, the historian Paul Lovejoy, he's informed by Walter Rodney's thesis, and he argues against the minimal impact of the transatlantic slave trade. His transformation thesis holds that the Atlantic slave trade marked a radical break in the history of Africa, which resulted in forms of dependency and greater exploitation of labor within African societies. And he mentions population decline, social dislocation, loss of life from enslavement, and subsequent famine and disease, and concludes that there's a causal relationship between the transatlantic slave trade and Africans' underdevelopment. So to conclude, Walter Rodney's work in the 1960s and 70s was foundational for many reasons. In terms of the treatment of the Atlantic slave trade and its effects on African societies, it ushered in a multitude of works, some of which aim to critique Rodney's work. For students of African descent, Rodney's work was particularly impactful. As mentioned, SOAS was part of Britain's imperialist project. It was built to skill elite such as Enoch Powell, who studied Urdu with the aim of becoming the Viceroy of India. And that wasn't realized, and we know about Enoch Powell and his legacy in Britain. So this environment at SOAS was intellectually hostile, as Walter Rodney describes, whether you're in economics, politics, development studies, or history. African writers are often dismissed or not recognized. Not even on the curriculum sometimes, and in favor of mainly white men. This is changing because of the efforts to decolonize the curriculum and projects such as Why is my professor white? Why is my curriculum white? So this speaks to my time at SOAS as an undergraduate some 14 years ago. That's why it was invigorating and affirming to take classes in the BA in African Studies program, which is now dissolved. African descended students experience microaggression and racism. And within this colonial neoliberal environment, you know, you're often one of the few Black students in the class with usually a white professor. So this is the context. And I remember one professor mentioned when I taught at SOAS that Black students are just too emotional when it comes to slavery. So Walter Rodney's contribution reiterating this. So we often heard terms like phrases such as Africans sold other Africans. And Walter Rodney his work pushed me to consider African elites and the African masses, right? Identifying who these Africans were. And you often hear terms, phrases such as, what did Africans get for slavery? And Walter Rodney's work encouraged me to think about greed and European capitalism and the loss of human life. At SOAS, we're often introduced to texts that would class enslaved peoples as slaves and commodities, and how they were cheap and seen as necessary for the development of American plantations. And Walter Rodney's work got us to think about European capitalism. And in terms of this idea, or the argument that slavery existed with Africa, Walter Rodney's work talked about these forms of independencies that were exacerbated with European demand for slavery and was very different from chattel slavery. And often the impact of the slave trade, as I mentioned before, was minimized. And you have all these economic analysis by these economic historians mostly, and Walter Rodney's work got me to think about how the cost is often immeasurable and unquantifiable, this social violence and the loss of life. So to conclude, or in summary, Rodney gifted many students with the language in which to express our histories in light of the violence reproduced in the classroom, the colonial archives, and secondary reading materials. Thank you.